standing. My name is Bo Moore. I'm currently serving as Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences here at the Citadel. On behalf of the college, welcome to this very special program, which is made possible through the generous support of the Harry and Reba Hughey Foundation. Tonight's program features 5 men who will speak together publicly for the first time about their experiences at the center of a major test to the proper functioning of our national government. As an American historian, I think it is appropriate to note that they are coming together for that purpose on the birthday of Abraham Lincoln. On December 1st, 1862, in the depths of the greatest crisis American government ever faced, the 16th President of the United States told his countrymen, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to our stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. For my fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation, as we either nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of Earth." Lincoln's words were spoken to the members of his generation as a summons to preserve the American Union. But they echo down through the ages as a more general summons to the members of each generation of Americans to engage in the arduous work that is necessary to safeguard and advance the health of our democracy amidst the unique challenges that arise in the times in which we live. Few of those times were more challenging than the early 1970s. The broad outlines of the crisis in American government that occurred then and how it was resolved is the subject of the following short documentary film produced by Matthew Graves to serve as the launching pad for our panel discussion.
We have a mystery story out of Washington. 5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the middle of the night.
5 men carried cameras and apparently ran an electronic bar. Police said they were thoroughly professional. The suspects are saying nothing. The Democrats say they have no idea who was on the spot.
Mr. Nixon says emphatically that the White House is in no way involved in the burglary and mugging to the Democratic headquarters. He'll have no further comment on that matter.
The President, obviously, or anybody in the White House, have any responsibility for it?
ABC News has projected that Richard Nixon has in fact been re-elected to the presidency.
Whatever happened to Watergate?
I don't know. Apparently nothing.
The Washington Post reported today that the FBI has established that high Republican officials had ordered a major political campaign of spying and sabotage against the Democrats to reassure President Nixon's re-election this year. And as part of that campaign, to the Post, the Democratic National Headquarters was buzzed with electronic surveillance equipment last June. The Post says the espionage operation on the president's behalf was called the Offensive Security Program. It began in 1971, according to the newspaper, and was aimed first at the major contenders for the Democratic presidential nomination. Its goal, infiltration and subversion.
The inevitable question, who is Deep Throat?
I never leaked any information. I didn't give anybody any documents, and I'm getting pretty fed up with the whole thing.
The Senate tonight voted 77 to nothing to establish a select committee to investigate alleged political espionage in last year's election campaign. All members of the White House staff will testify under oath if requested.
I condemn any attempts to cover up in this case, no matter who is involved.
Privately confirming stories carried in today's Washington Post, these sources say that McGruber has told federal investigators that he attended a meeting in the office of then Attorney General John Mitchell in February of last year, where he says the Watergate break-in was plotted by Mitchell, G. Gordon
John Dean III, personal counselor to President Nixon. McGruder is alleged to have told investigators that Mitchell also arranged payoffs to the convicted Watergate burglars in attempts to buy their silence.
Mr. President, there is something I want to speak to you about. People on your staff are trying to mortally wound you by using the CIA and FBI.
The Watergate scandal broke wide open today. The two closest men to the president, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, have resigned.
The initial White House investigator of Watergate, John Dean, was fired.
How high up in the White House does it go? And is the president himself involved?
Alexander Butterfield, a former White House aide, appeared before the committee with startling new testimony.
Butterfield said he was in charge of the presidential bugging system. It seemed that in the spring of 1970, President Nixon ordered that certain of his White House offices and certain of his White House telephones be bugged, so that everything that was said could be tape recorded.
The committee immediately asked for those tapes, and today it got its reply, a formal official no.
President Nixon today defied subpoenas demanding that he produce tapes and papers in his possession, and the country moved closer to a clash between the White House, the Congress, and the courts, which would be unprecedented in American history.
I believe the time has come to bring that investigation and the other investigations of this matter to an end.
President Nixon has discharged Watergate special prosecutor. The FBI, acting upon orders from the president, sealed off the special prosecutor's office.
Ruckelshaus refused, in a moment of constitutional drama, to obey a presidential order to fire the special Watergate prosecutor.
Well, there'll be an announcement out of the White House later on. I can't say anything. There will be. Does it have to do with the resignation of Craig Gunn? Well, it might.
After the events of the weekend, there is growing sentiment here for the impeachment of the president.
The question of whether a president still in office can be indicted in the criminal courts. It is far from settled. That can be done.
I have never obstructed justice. People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
The Supreme Court has just ruled on the tape controversy, and here's Carl Stanton has that rule. It is a unanimous decision, Doug, 8-0. Justice Rehnquist took note prior to the decision, ordering the President of the United States to turn over the tapes.
After 4 months of legal squabbling, the presidential tape recordings were finally delivered today to Chief Judge John Sirica.
Now, one of the investigations, the Democratic Party thing, we're about to the problem area because the FBI is not under control, and their investigation is now the surrounding areas without going into details on why they chance to involve military state. This is sort of a comedy of errors, and they call the FBI and some of them don't go any further in this case.
Before he did all this, he must have considered the probable reaction in Congress, including the possibility of impeachment.
Resolved that Richard M. Nixon, President of the United States, is impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors.
In Washington today, the mood of expectation that the president would step down changed rapidly to one of almost certainty. The pressure built quickly and became unbearable when both Republicans in Congress and some senior White House staff members demanded he quit.
Good evening. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The relatively unheralded patriots you're about to hear spearheaded the investigations that produced the evidence needed to right the wrongs depicted in that documentary. In the process, these 5 citizens, as Lincoln would say, navigated their way through the fiery trial of their era that lights them down in the moment
In the history of American democracy. To tell you more about them, it's my pleasure to present to you the head of the Citadel Department of Intelligence and Security Studies, Dr. Carl Jensen.
this historic panel. As Bo said, my name is Carl Jensen, and I am the department head of the Department of Intelligence and Security Studies here at the Citadel. I'm also a retired FBI agent, and I never rose to high rank within the Bureau. I never really aspired to. In fact, I spent my career in the trenches. And I did that because I felt the most important work in the Bureau was done by the folks in the trenches. So I'm about to introduce to you a panel of men for whom my respect knows no bounds. They worked in the trenches of Washington Field Office's Criminal 2, or Miscellaneous Crime Squad. They weren't on some flashy Gambino organized crime squad in New York or down in Quantico profiling serial killers. In fact, they worked the bread and butter cases that provided the foundation for the FBI in the 1970s. Unglamorous things like theft of government property, crimes on military reservations, and please keep your seats, the Migratory Bird Act. On June 17, 1972, Special Agent Angelo Lano of C2 caught a burglary case involving a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel. Like any other case assigned to any other agent, I'm sure his supervisor told him to handle it as best he could. And handle it, these men did. Despite unrelenting pressure, their sheer tenacity and reverence for the rule of law led them to do extraordinary things. From the bullpen at the old post office building just yards from the White House, they put together a case that ultimately led to the resignation of the President of the United States and the successful prosecution of several of his aides. And tonight they get to tell their story. As my colleague Melissa Graves so eloquently put it in an op-ed that appeared today in today's Post and Courier, without the agents from the FBI's District of Columbia field office, Watergate would have died on the vine soon after June 17, 1972, when 5 burglars sat in the DC jail and refused to discuss their break-in. These Bureau agents chased leads, followed money trails, and developed informants to uncover the evidence that implicated Nixon and those within his administration. They executed a meticulous investigation despite Bureau turmoil. For years, they remained mostly silent about their work. These agents carried out what was arguably the most important case in the FBI's history and then disappeared into obscurity. They received no accolades. History has attributed their successes to other people. Now more than ever, we need their perspective. We need to hear from those who operated successfully at a difficult time. We crave a story about the good guys. So as a retired special agent of the FBI, it gives me a pleasure you can't even imagine to introduce some of the good guys, men who are personal heroes of mine. So, gentlemen, please raise your hands when I call your name. John Mindermann. John was the weekend off-duty case agent of the day of the Watergate break-in who helped secure the White House in the spring of 1973. John is also an author. He's written a book called In Pursuit, From the Streets of San Francisco to Watergate. There are copies for sale if you're interested in purchasing that on the table outside. Paul Magallanes, who developed sources to establish a money connection between the committee to re-elect the president and the Watergate burglary. John Kleinig. John served at FBI headquarters under directors J. Edgar Hoover and L. Patrick Gray. Daniel Mahan. Dan conducted the majority of the White House interviews for the Bureau, including John Dean, Charles Colson, David Young, and G. Gordon Liddy. And finally, Angelo Lano. Angelo was the lead investigator and case agent assigned to the Watergate case. And let me tell you, the case agent of any case is the heart and soul of that case. And we're also very privileged tonight to have 3 of their wives in attendance. And let me tell you, spouses, significant others, and the families of FBI special agents and professional support staff also serve. They know firsthand the loneliness when their significant others are absent for birthdays, holidays, or soccer games because they're doing round-the-clock investigations on cases they can never discuss. And these days, there are the significant others who know the loneliness when their FBI personnel deploy to Iraq or Afghanistan. So those who support and sacrifice also serve. So let's please recognize Carol Mindermann, Mary Ann Kleineck, and Judy Lano. And finally, I am very pleased to recognize my colleague and the person who brought all of this together, Dr. Melissa Graves, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Intelligence and Security Studies. Melissa has worked tirelessly for a long, long time to put this together. She spent countless hours on the phone and has traveled across the country to secure interviews and peruse presidential libraries and national archives. Her relentless pursuit of the truth and history has led to an extraordinary book that's going to be released later this year, titled Nixon's FBI, the Bureau in Crisis. A more timely work I cannot imagine. So without further ado, I ask you to please welcome this wonderful panel, and I turn it over to my great friend and colleague, Melissa Graves.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. We're very honored to have each one of you here at the Citadel, and this is the Citadel's privilege to host you, so thank you for being here. Just to kind of give you an idea of how this evening is going to work, we're going to have a conversation up here about Watergate. A lot of these men haven't seen each other since they worked the Watergate investigation, so it's actually been a really interesting couple of days seeing them reunite, seeing them remember stories. They don't know each other's stories. They're going to tell stories up here that they haven't all heard before. So this is really their first time since they worked the Watergate investigation to come together and to talk to you about this. In no way are we going to hit everything about Watergate. We could sit up here all week and fill this room with stories day after day and still not tell everything. But what we're going to try to get to tonight are some of the most incredible stories that they have, their memories that have stuck with them all these years. And so that's what we're going to focus on tonight. So gentlemen, the first thing that I want to ask you is to tell us, what was the Bureau like in 1972? What was going on in the country? What was going on within the FBI?
1972 in the early 70s was a holdover from the 60s, the protests of the Vietnam demonstrators. And this was the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. There were armed guards lining the bridges to and from the Capitol. There was the aroma of tear gas in the air. And the protesters blocked entrances to the various federal buildings trying to shut down the government. Pretty much everyone showed up to work anyway. You know, they walked across and all this. But it was not an easy time. It was a scary time. It was unlike anything I had known before or since, for that matter. And in this atmosphere of unease, we all get immersed in the Watergate scandal.
So what was, you're talking about kind of the chaos that's going on in the country. What are these people protesting? What are they so upset about?
Mostly the Vietnam War. That was the major, among other things, and I can't list the other things, but that was the major effort, yes, and that had gone on for years. It was not brand new in the 70s.
And so you in the Bureau, are you concerned with these protests, with this atmosphere of chaos in DC?
Absolutely, absolutely. And no one knew for sure what would result from these protests. Would it become an active firing of weapons, or what would happen? No one knew. And so it was a defensive posture of, wow, what is going on here, and what's going to happen? Where is it coming from, and where is it going?
So 1972, May 2nd, 1972, J. Edgar Hoover, who has been director of the FBI for 48 years, dies. He dies 6 weeks before Watergate. What are your memories of Hoover's death, of how you learned about that, of what that meant to the Bureau?
For me? Yeah, go ahead, John.
On May 2nd, 72, one of my auxiliary duties as a special agent in the Washington field office was to teach firearms and qualification runs down at Quantico for the agents assigned to the Washington field office. So on May 2nd, 1972, I was in a tower running a line of about 35 special agents qualifying from the 50-yard line on up to the 7-yard line in various positions of fire. It was about 11:15 in the morning when I was in that tower, and an agent came up to me and in effect called time out, and I looked down at him and he said, "Hoover died." And I looked at him because we all knew the Hoove couldn't die. He had been there since 1924. No one could conceive of J. Edgar Hoover dying. I said, "What?" He said, "J. Edgar Hoover died." I said, "Don't be kidding me, because I'm going to have to take some action here." He said, no, it's for real. J. Edgar Hoover died. So very hesitatingly, I was mulling over what action to take, and I thought, I don't want 35 distracted special agents with weapons shooting under my command. So I made a spontaneous announcement. I said, firearms qualification is called off for the day. You're free to do anything you choose to. So in effect, I gave a free pass to 35 special agents.
July. At headquarters, the reaction was, now headquarters consisted of, at that time, we co-shared the Justice Building. So we had so many floors and all that, and there were some 600-700 agents assigned to headquarters, and several thousand of support personnel. And the reaction that I saw, which is a small sample, were many of the support personnel cried. They was very sorry for it happened. Some of them said, good. Good for him. But mostly the attitude was, as John said, this couldn't happen. What's going to happen next? There was no succession plan. No one ever talked of a succession plan. And all of a sudden there was, holy smokes, what are we doing? What's going to happen now? And that was the attitude now. It was one of awe and unbelief and not knowing what the future holds.
And so in Hoover's absence, Nixon appoints a Navy captain by the name of L. Patrick Gray to lead the Bureau. What do you remember about Gray and his leadership?
Well, Gray was a submarine commander, and then he was Solicitor General in the Department of Justice. He was appointed just, I guess, 2 days after Hoover's death, and he came over in an atmosphere of probably unacceptance. He didn't know us. He didn't know our culture. He didn't know how we worked. He didn't know the terminology. He was brand new, and of course he had to ask questions and start getting up to speed, which takes a long time. And people were just kind of, what's going to happen now? this fellow doesn't know. He doesn't know us, and he's from the Department of Justice. May I say this? The relationship between the Department of Justice and the FBI was kind of like the Navy and the Marines, and that started changing when L. Patrick Gray came across from the Justice Department. Our culture began to change. We were beginning to be incorporated more into the Justice Department than ever had been before.
All right, so Angelo, walk us through when you found out about the Watergate burglary on June 17th.
At about approximately 8 a.m. Saturday, June 17th, 1972. Now, just close your eyes and think for a minute. We're the FBI. We're the great intelligence investigators around. We had no cell phones. We didn't have computers. We had a fax machine, a telephone, which we shared with 4 or 5 other agents, and a teletype machine. So that morning, the supervisor for the weekend duty was an individual named Ernie Belter. So Belter calls me and he says there's been a burglary at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. 5 international jewel thieves were arrested, and your special agent in charge, Bob Kunkel, wants you down there immediately. And I said, okay, it's 8 o'clock. I'm leaving shortly for baseball practice with my sons, and you have a weekend duty agent, call him. That's generally the way it goes. And Ernie said, no, Kunkel wants you. We hung up the phone. No, 30 seconds later, Kunkel calls and he says, look, your wife can handle the baseball practice. You go down and you'll be home probably in about 2 hours, but take somebody with you. So I get my associate, Peter Paul. We race on down to the 2nd District headquarters, introduce ourselves to the Deputy Chief of Police, Assistant United States Attorney Chuck Wirt, and the detectives who made the arrest earlier that morning. We asked permission to go back and talk to the 5 arrestees. We went back. They all declined to be interviewed, said they would rather talk to an attorney before they speak to us. We walked back out front. I spoke to the arresting detectives. They explained what had happened, why the arrest took place. I asked to review the seized material that was in possession of the burglars at the time of the arrest. There was a fire alarm detection box, which you have in your homes, and there was a wire dangling from it. And one of the detectives says, well, we thought this was a bomb. And in examining it, I said, no, that's a microphone on the end of that wire. So there was a closed gym bag that men carry around with them. Opened up the gym bag, and there were 2 brand new 35 millimeter cameras, 53 rolls of 35 millimeter film, and down underneath that was a pile of tissue paper. Pulled out the tissue paper, and out fell this black device, which turns out to be a telephone monitoring device. Reached back into the bag, a second one came out, then a third one came out. I turned to the Assistant U.S. Attorney and to the Deputy Chief of Police, and I said, this isn't a routine burglary. These devices are used for intercepting communications.
So you knew from the beginning that there's something kind of strange about this burglary. What were some of the things that stuck out to you from the beginning that said this isn't routine?
What struck out most was after we took a tour of the office location where the Democratic National Committee headquarters was that there was only some office papers scattered on the floor, a file cabinet partially open, a ceiling tile removed, and none of the telephones were hampered or were interfered with in any way. The money that the defendants, now these were 5 men dressed in business suits wearing rubber gloves at the time of the arrest, and they had some money on them, a total of about maybe $1,000 between all 7, but they had $100 bills on them, which were sequential. And from there, the affidavit was being drawn up by the burglary squad detectives who were there so that we could go into the Watergate Hotel. The only reason we were going there was because two of the defendants had keys to room 214 and I think 323, something like that, of the Watergate complex. When we went there, when you walked into the room, opened up the door, walked into the room, there was a balcony to the left. The windows were, the doors were open to the balcony. The curtains were blowing out into the sunshine. And I looked down, and it was about an 18-foot drop. So I said, well, nobody went that way. On the bed in the room was wallets, $100 bills, airline tickets, some other identification forms. Two of the other agents, Pete Paul and another agent, Don Stuckey, began a search of the dresser. And in the dresser, they found an envelope. And inside the envelope was a check drawn on the account of Everett Howard Hunt of Potomac, Maryland. And there was a return address on the envelope, same address, same name, and it was being made out to a country club in the area.
So E. Howard Hunt's name becomes pretty critical to the investigation, and this sort of leads you to the White House. Can you, so let's talk for a second about these burglars, and then we'll get to E. Howard Hunt. So they're sitting in the DC jail, they're refusing to talk, but some of you go to the DC jail and try to interview them. And how did that go? Can you kind of paint a picture for us? What was the DC jail like those days?
The DC jail, as I recall, was something that was around the 18th century. It was very inhospitable. It was a jail that nobody obviously wanted to be in, and it was like the Dark Ages. And I had gone there several times for other cases, and I hated going there because it was so dark and very eerie. It reminded me of the jail in San Juan, Puerto Rico, which I went to after Washington, D.C. That jail, or that prison, was even worse. It suggested that they tortured people in there. But getting back to the D.C. jail, when I interviewed the Cubans, in terms of interviewing them.
And tell us why they're Cubans. Who are these people? Where do they come from?
The Cubans were operatives. They were all CIA operatives previous to this particular Watergate burglary. One in particular, by the name of Angelo Martinez, had done over 300, almost 400 operations for the CIA. And so what they did, they were recruited by E. Howard Hunt. E. Howard Hunt was working for the White House. He had an office in the White House. Some described that office as a closet, but nonetheless he had an office in the White House. And so when each of them were recruited by them, they eagerly accepted the assignment because E. Howard Hunt was involved as a manager, as a leader in the Bay of Pigs. And so were the Cubans. And so what happened was that when they were approached by E. Howard Hunt, they eagerly accepted because they respected him so much and admired him so much. And so there was Bernard Barker, who was a real estate agent in Miami. There was another individual by the name of Fioroni, and he was a driver in Miami, as I recall. And Virgilio Martinez, who was in real estate, along with Barker. There was another Cuban who was a locksmith. And At any rate, they were all recruited by E. Howard Hunt, and they participated. They're the ones that participated in the actual break-in.
So I have to stop you here, because if I find myself in the DC jail under these terms in this abysmal place that you described, I'm freaking out. And yet that was not the attitude that you saw at all from them. What was their attitude when you went in to interview them?
Well, their demeanor was, I would describe it as very flippant, because they told me, and all the interviews were in Spanish, and some of the interviews were very short, only because although they respected me and they respected the FBI, they knew they were going to get off, and they told me so. Hey, they're going to take care of me and my family, and you know, we're both working for the same man. I said, well, what do you mean by that? He says, well, you know, we're working for the president. And I said, I don't know about you guys, but I'm not working for the president. I work for the Constitution. I took an oath to the Constitution, not to a president. And the one that struck me the most was Virgilio Martinez, because he was more open, and he was the most animated. And he came right out and said, hey, you know, we're going to be taken care of. So you know, we're working for the same guy. You know what the rules are. We can't give you anything, because you already know them. So he was a kind of a lovable guy, who was, by the way, subsequently pardoned by the president, Reagan. And probably because of all these operations that he conducted for the FBI, and maybe there was some political stuff in there because, you know, Reagan needed the Cubans in Miami, so, but I'm not sure.
All right, so you have these burglars, they're not talking, or they're telling you we work for the same man, so you're not getting a whole lot of information there. So, Angelo, you and Dan have the task of going to the White House to talk to Nixon's staff member, Chuck Colson, to figure out who E. Howard Hunt is. Can you tell us about that interview and who was present in that interview with Chuck Colson?
Well, we got to the White House to interview Chuck Colson, who was assistant to the president, as a result of reviewing a file which reflected that the FBI had conducted what we call a special inquiry investigation into E. Howard Hunt. In other words, the White House had requested the FBI to do a background on this individual for potential employment with the White House. As it turns out, he was to be hired as a consultant to Chuck Colson. So we put in a request to FBI headquarters. We wanted to go and speak with Mr. Colson. Dan and I did. We made the appointment through John Dean, who was the attorney for the White House. During the course of our investigation and interview of Chuck Colson, he told us when Howard Hunt had been hired, what his duties were, and he mentioned that on one particular assignment, he had sent Howard Hunt to Denver, Colorado for an interview of a woman named Dita Beard, who was involved with the distribution of a $200,000 campaign contribution to the Nixon campaign. After we had summarized that interview in the presence of John Dean, we started to pack up to leave, and I asked Mr. Colson if if Mr. Hunt had an office there, and Colson's reply was, I wouldn't call it an office, it was more like a closet. And Dean says, I didn't know he had an office, and if he'd had an office, what business is it of yours? And I had a piece of paper in my pocket, and I kind of just showed it slightly, and I said, because I have a grand jury subpoena for him to immediately appear and testify in this investigation.
Was it a real subpoena?
Pardon?
Was it a real subpoena?
No, it wasn't. It was just a sheet of paper.
But it worked.
But he didn't. Anyway, the interest was whether or not, and Hunt had disappeared for a weekend, but what I was interested in was was there anything visible on his desk that would indicate the name of someone we could contact or a telephone number.
Right, because you don't know where he is.
No, we didn't. And we didn't ask. Yeah, well, he was there the first day. Yeah, then he took off. Yeah. He said he would get back in touch with us if he discovered anything.
So you leave things as Colson says he has basically a closet for an office. Dean says, oh, I didn't know he had an office. And then several days later, you hear from Dean. What happened?
Well, we had asked for the contents of Hunt's office, and John Dean kept saying, I'll get it to you, I'll get it to you, get it to you. And this was going on for days, and I was at the White House almost daily interviewing someone else, and I would continuously ask the contents of Dean's office.
And is Dean present in all your interviews?
Yes. Yeah.
And why is he in your interviews?
I'm not just, we had to conduct the interviews with Dean present.
Okay.
That's what my understanding was. If I interviewed anybody at the White House, it had to be in the presence of John Dean. I learned subsequently that he was allegedly doing some type of background or some investigation for the White House to find out what happened. Every time I went there, that he kept saying, I'd get you the information, but he never did. What, 6 days later?
Yeah, the 26th.
Yeah, 6 days later, when I went there, I forget who I was interviewing, there was a brown box in his office. And he told me that was the contents of Mr. Hunt's office and I could take it. Well, I told him that box hasn't been there all week. He told me it's been there all week. You could have taken it any time.
He's saying that box has just been sitting there, that you've never
That's what he said. But it couldn't have been. And we got in a little, we got in a little contest, and I essentially called him a liar. Then I took the bus back to our headquarters, 4 blocks away. At about 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Why did you take the bus?
There were no cars available. And on the bus, there was a plain brown. I asked for you, by the way. You weren't around. There was a brown cardboard box, and Fred Fielding, who was Dean's assistant, had written in red magic marker top secret all over this box. And I'm riding a DC bus with a top secret box. I just want to go back just a hair, because I don't know if this got enough attention. When John was talking about the background, when Hoover died, the mucky-mucks for the administration of the FBI wanted an internal new director. We wanted a director from within the FBI. And when Gray was appointed, they were not happy with that. And I think that a lot of other ramifications came about because Gray wanted to be director, and the longtime hierarchy of the FBI did not want that to happen, and they did everything they could to prevent it. But anyway, back to the cardboard box. I get to the office with my box. The SAC wants to see me. I have to go and dictate a communication to his secretary as to why I called John Dean a liar. So obviously, Dean had contacted someone at our headquarters. I did it in his office, dictated a communication, citing what had happened, and that communication was instrumental in Gray not getting confirmed because he was told at a certain date that Dean was lying to his agents.
And that comes up in his Senate confirmation.
Correct.
Where he is not confirmed.
Correct.
Yeah. And so, Angelo, when Dan hands you this box, you're immediately wondering about the chain of custody because Dean, a few days earlier, had said, I don't know about I didn't know he had an office.
Right.
So how do you trace down how that box got to you after that interview, the initial interview that you did with Colson and Dean?
Well, I send my second in command, Dan, back to his job.
We never saw, my recollection, saw
the box.
Hunt's office.
No, we didn't.
We never saw his office. All we saw was this box that came down 6 or 7 days after we had asked for it, saying from Dean, this is the contents of his office.
Right. And then when you look at White House records, who had pulled these items from Hunt's safe? Who had ordered that?
Well, we sent him back for a third trip.
Right.
And this time was to do a chain of evidence examination, which you do. You forgot. So Dan takes Bob Lill with him, and they contact the GSA. First they go to John Dean. He explains that Fred Fielding was in charge of the removal. With Fred Fielding, Dean's assistant, they go to the GSA, to a Secret Service person, to a guy who actually drilled open the safe to get the contents out. So Dan and his crew do a background, and we trace it back to the day we're sitting there doing the interview. 3 days before we did the interview, Dean had the office, the contents of Hunt's safe in his office. June the 19th, he had the contents. June the 22nd, we're interviewing Colson. June the 22nd, Dean says, I don't know anything about it. So
this is a big moment for you in the case.
The other thing about interviewing with John Dean present, when you complete your education training at Quantico, you're given this gigantic handbook. And buried in that handbook is one of the rules. You do not conduct interviews in the presence of attorneys unless the person has been convicted and wants to confess his sins, wants to go forward. You don't do it. Washington Field was the only division out of 56 field offices in the country that was restricted to that.
So the FBI in the Watergate investigation is not playing by its own rules.
It wasn't so much the rules as it was an order to not go pursuant to the rules. And the order came down from the White House. I mean, here is the highest executive in government ordering you, and you had to abide by that. And by the way, I know I speak for everyone here. I want to thank Dr. Graves and Dr. Jensen for putting this together. This is really an historic occasion because first time ever, as you know, that the original FBI investigators of the Watergate case are together. We haven't seen each other in over 50 years, some of us. So it's a big achievement for Dr. Graves and Dr. Jensen. And I also want to ask, how many were alive in 1972?
Quite a crowd out there.
Those of you that weren't alive, there's going to be a lot of questions, I'm sure, because, you know, you guys weren't even here yet. To you, it's probably like 1,000 years ago, you know? So I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, absolutely.
May I add something about
Of course.
The investigation was unique. Talk about not following some of the rules. Well, this was brand new. This hadn't happened before. There was no precedence on which to rely. Some of the investigation flowed in a natural course, regardless of some of the rules, like the Dean interviews. You know, this was allowed to happen. We were told Dean was in charge of the White House investigation of Watergate, and that he would co-investigate with us, and that he would sit on the interviews. Well, this is normally not done, but it was done during Watergate. Lots of things were done differently. Leads were set out, as Angelo said earlier, almost all of the 50, I think there were 59. 59 field officers at that time. I think 57, 58 were involved covering leads. And we didn't do all of the work at all. There were hundreds of agents who worked on it. They were called out. Leads were set out by telephone. They were followed up by what we called a teletype, which was pretty fast, right? And then it was followed up. The reporting was reported back, maybe by phone, but always by teletype on a daily basis. Is that correct? And then summarized every week, and it would come to headquarters, not only daily, but summarized weekly, and reports every week. So there was an abundance of reporting, abundance of leads going out, an abundance of reporting coming back that then had to be summarized, sorted, analyzed, and sent up through the channels so that Acting Director Gray, Mark Felt, et cetera, down the line, all were filled in all the time on what was going on.
All right.
So it wasn't a normal investigation.
Yeah.
Can I go back to one episode?
I want to make it clear, I don't want the audience to misconceive what the FBI was about, because what's emerging here right now is very, very accurate with respect to oversight and control from a paper perspective. And that's important to a certain degree. But what is much more important is this. When you become an FBI agent, when you finish training school, and when you go out to your first field office, it is made abundantly clear to you from your peers and from your superiors by hints, by statements, by general conduct, and by overall feel. You are an FBI agent. There are not many FBI agents in this nation or posted overseas. So you have a great responsibility. And from day one, they respect your opinion and they anticipate that you will give it, even to the most senior agent, when you're participating as a group to try and figure out what you need to do. It's been mentioned that some things were done which might not be regulation within the FBI cadre. My take has always been, when people ask me, well, what did you do, or what do you do as an FBI agent? My answer has always been very, very short. We do what is necessary and what we want to do. We work for the American people to protect the Republic and to ensure that we will perpetuate this democracy. That's a broad mandate. So each one of us had to step up, be creative, and do some things that were perhaps pushing the boundaries, which brings me to the point of why we're here in this conference, because it's about ethical work and what are the boundaries in intelligence work. In this particular case, there were many times when we pushed those boundaries, but always made the decisions with the idea that we're protecting the public.
Angelo, what were you going to add?
I just want to go back to the time of arrest.
Yeah.
During the recovery of the items that were seized that day, I mentioned the $100 bills in sequential order. I had a friend who worked for the Secret Service, and when we got back to the field office that afternoon, I contacted him and I asked John, I said, you know, I need some help. I have these sequential serial numbers. Can you run them for me? And of course he says, can't do anything until Monday. So come Monday morning, when his place is just going haywire, John from the Secret Service calls me back and he says, okay, the bills were printed on such and such a date, and 100,000 was sent to Atlanta. From Atlanta, they went to Miami Federal Reserve. So I had to call down to Atlanta, have agents go there to verify that. Call down to Miami, have agents verify that at the Miami Federal Reserve. From there, the Miami Federal Reserve said on, I think it was April the 10th of '72, $50,000 in sequential $100 bills, which you recovered back here in Washington, appeared at the Republic National Bank. It just so happened that Mr. Barker, one of the arrested individuals on that morning, had a bank account at the Republic National Bank. In his bank account with a subpoena, the agents located these 4 checks that came out of Mexico City, along with another check that came from Mr. Dahlberg up in Minneapolis. We couldn't figure out how these foreign checks were deposited into Barker's bank account. We later figured that out. But at that time, it just so happened that on April 10th, when the bank okayed those checks to be cleared, here comes $50,000 in $100 bills, sequential $100 bills. and the bank manager remembered 10,000 of that was given to Mr. Barker. The money was turned over to either Howard Hunt or an individual we'll later talk about, Gordon Liddy, which was then carried back to Washington and given to the committee to re-elect the president. So.
Yeah, and this is what you're figuring out all that first week. I mean, this is an amazing amount of information that you're uncovering just within the first few days. Dave?
Just let me just try to give you a capsule where we are now. It didn't take an intellectual giant to figure out that Dean was working for the White House. He was present during our interviews. I'm convinced that if J. Hoover had lived, Watergate would never have happened. Dean would have never called over to the FBI headquarters and say, I want copies of your investigation. But that's where we are now, where the White House, through Dean, is getting the FBI work product.
And you don't know this.
We don't know that at this point, but that's what's happening. All this information that Andy and everybody else is talking about is being funneled to the FBI. Dean's present during the interviews, and the summaries that Andy would do just about every day was going to Dean's office, unbeknownst to us at that time. So essentially, that's where we are now.
And what's really interesting about, we keep talking about Dean and he's getting this information. The person at the FBI who authorizes Dean to have that information is the new acting director, L. Patrick Gray.
Well, you could say it that way, but it was a surreptitious delivering of the goods.
We didn't know. We had no knowledge of it.
It wasn't an official chain of him getting and being disseminated information. He was getting it sub rosa, so to speak.
Right. So let's talk about let's talk about Gray for a second. And I think now is as good a time as any to talk about the Saturday morning massacre. Can you tell us what was that?
A week after the break-in, so the break-in's on the 17th, the evening of the 23rd, there are between 25 and 28 agents in Washington field working, not talking to the other 350 out in the field. The SAC, the agent in charge, Bob Kunkel, comes up, and as we're having our 5 o'clock meeting, Kunkel says, I want everybody back in the office 10 o'clock tomorrow morning sharp, just like you are now. And a couple of guys thought, gee, we did something good this week. We're going to get an award. We didn't know why we had to be there. But he said, we're going to meet the acting director at 11.
Is this normal? Do you meet the acting director very often as an FBI agent?
Not normally, no.
Meet one-on-one might be, but, a group of 27.
Okay.
So that following morning, Saturday morning, we all lined up in our dress uniforms and marched across the street in a column of twos, went up to the director's office.
Fifth floor.
And this is Hoover's old office.
Kunkel, we all met at Kunkel's office.
Right.
Special agent in charge. And before we went over to headquarters, and Kunkel said, I don't know what this is about, gentlemen, but don't embarrass me. I remember that distinctly. And he said, but, whatever it is, it should be good or it should be bad, that type of thing. I'm sorry.
That's all right. No, that's fine.
And so we all walked up into the inner sanctum, if you will. I'm going to say there's 27 of us, including the special agent in charge and the assistant special agent in charge. And we walk in there, and there are 2 officers that Hoover used.
Okay, before we get into that, don't forget when we went in there, we file in one at a time, and as we go in, there's an assistant director in charge of the criminal division named Charlie Bates. And Bates is checking us off one at a time. As we entered, we had to give our names, and Bates would check us off. When he came to me, and I gave him my name, he kind of perked up a little bit. He looked very, very grim, holding this clipboard and checking our names off. So I was not optimistic about what was going to happen to us when I looked at Bates. And Bates said to me, he said, oh, Mindermann, he says, you're from San Francisco. I said, yes, sir, I am. He said, well, I was the SAC out there for a while. So he perked up, and we didn't have time to share stories about San Francisco. But as I cleared Bates and continued on in, I thought to myself, oh, this is not good. He knows I'm from San Francisco. He knows my background. He has pulled my personnel file, and my God, he's reviewed all our personnel files. This is not going to end well.
And so Gray is in Hoover's old office, right?
Yes, it was in Hoover's old office, and you had a conference room, and then you had his office, Hoover's office, where, of course, acting director Gray was, and he made us wait. We were all standing around the conference room, and he made us wait. And of course, everybody was kind of wondering what's going on here. And finally, the man storms in, and he says, "Gentlemen, I got a call last night from Sandy Smith." Sandy Smith was a reporter for Time magazine. And he gave me information about the investigation, and that information could only have come from you. One of you people, or some of you people here present, conspicuously absent at this meeting or at this conference was Felt. And he should have been there because he was the number 2 man. But anyway, he proceeded to tell us that he got this call and that we, one of us or some of us, were responsible for leaking. And he said, "I want that man or those men to step forward who leaked the information." Well, of course, nobody stepped forward. And SAC, Special Agent in Charge, Kunkel, started to say something. And he says, "Are you leaking?" He says, "No, sir." "Then get back." So nobody said a word. And all of a sudden, Gray gets beet red. I mean, his face was beet red. And his veins, you could see they were popping out.
Are you here?
He was shaking. And he says, he called us. He said, "I'll have you know that I was a commander in a submarine. And I have held court martials in the past." And he said, "So I know what this is about." And he says, "And I know one of you or some of you are leaking." And he proceeded to call us yellow sniveling agents and yellow-bellied agents as well, and other unsavory things. Everybody was shocked, absolutely shocked. And because we thought perhaps we'd get an attaboy or something.
What do you remember him calling?
I want to say you got to come with me for a moment here, and the rest of us around this oval table in J. Edgar Hoover's office, with 27 of us, and our SAC, our leader, the individual who commands 350 agents in Washington Fields, is the head, the second in command, the supervisor, and the remainder of us. When Kunkel stepped out to try and defend us, he took one tentative step out and he tried to speak. He got a couple words out, and Gray pointed at him. He was very close to Gray. The rostrum was right there. And Gray said, "Are you the leaker, Mr. Kunkel?" Just like that. And Kunkel said, "No, sir, I'm not." Gray says, "Well, then take one step back." Wow. Kunkel takes one step back, and we are frozen in place. And what you have to come to grips with here is the manner in which Gray deported himself. As Paul stated, when he came in, he was the epitome of the naval captain. Crew-cut gray hair, strong jaw, red in the face, angry before he came in. He came in and he grabbed that rostrum. And then he went into his rant and his tirade. And when no one stepped forward and acknowledged that they were the leaker, as a matter of fact, I think all of us were kind of looking this way. See, is anybody going to step forward here? I doubt it, because we weren't the leakers. The leaks never come from the bottom, because nobody at the bottom, nobody at entry level or slightly above that, has anything to gain from leaking anything? Who are the people who have something to gain? Mid-level and above. Why? They're competing for that next rung. So whether you're in the military, the FBI, a police department, or anywhere, if you're looking for a leaker, don't look at the bottom. They're going to be mid-level or top drawer because they want to get the top spot, and they're not going to get it unless they generate the helpful influence that they need. But I want to get back for just a minute to how this thing played out. When he didn't get the answer he wanted, he shifted into another gear. He was from another planet. This scene, which I'm going to recreate for you, came right out of that great movie and book by Herman Wouk, The Caine Mutiny. How many have read or seen The Caine Mutiny with Humphrey Bogart? Well, you remember the great scene with the ball bearings, and the officers are in the wardroom in this ship, and Queeg is going to get to the bottom of who stole the frozen strawberries. And Queeg has the ball bearings, the Navy captain, and I'm looking at Gray and I'm thinking, this is Commander Queeg. This is Captain Queeg. And I'm imagining Gray with the 2 steel balls as he says, I'll get to the bottom and find out who stole those strawberries. Mr. So-and-so, and he gets the sugar out and he starts measuring how many cups. I've proved that there's a cup of strawberries missing. Gray then shifted into another gear from another planet. He actually shook, he quivered, he turned crimson red, and he said, you will not fool me. I'm a naval captain. I'm a graduate of the Naval Academy. I'm a graduate of Georgetown Law School. I've conducted investigations. I will get to the bottom of it. And then as Paul said, he called us sniveling, yellow-bellied agents. You are flap-jawed informers. If any of you ever appears before me again, I will fire you. And he had the power to do that the way the FBI was set up. Then he kind of came erect, not in complete control, and he yelled, dismissed! Kind of froze up and quivered even more, and then he did a beautiful military about face, and he walked out, okay? I mean, what a scene. I wish every one of you were there to experience it, okay? We came together and we've relived some of this stuff, but there's a lot more to come, and I'm sure our moderator will get into it. I want to take a moment and share one thing with you. At the beginning of this case, some of you may have wondered, with all the organization, why didn't the burglars get out of the Democratic National Committee with their radios and their lookouts, the FBI agent as the lookout, ex-FBI agent as the lookout? Why didn't he radio when the cops came and entered? Well, the reason he didn't radio is this caper went down close to midnight. Midnight at the location of the Watergate on a Friday night, Saturday morning is adjacent to Georgetown. Georgetown in the district is the nightclub scene. At about midnight, anywhere in any city at the nightclub scene, the cops are all tied up because everybody who's been drinking all night long in the nightclubs begins fighting and arguing, and the cops are all tied up trying to settle these beefs. I did that work. I know that scene. That's what happens. They had one unit, and they dispatched one unit. I know this because there was a senior clerk listening to the police radio the night and morning the Watergate went down. And this is what he told me. John, he says, I've got to talk to you. I was on duty. I listened to the police radio. I heard what happened in the MPD. Let me tell you. I said, well, please tell me. He said the following. The marked car with the uniformed officers is dispatched. They're on the way. The lookout would have made them and radioed over there. We would have had no Watergate. They would have been out of the Democratic National Headquarters, dumped the stuff they had, and down the stairwell The best the cops would have gotten is a trespassing. These guys are trespassing in a building. They would have dumped everything. But they got caught as dirty as a burglar can get caught, holding the evidence at the scene when the police nabbed them. But the uniformed cops didn't get them. Here's what happened. The marked unit is dispatched. And I'm going into the radio call for you. They acknowledge the call. The next thing communications for MPD hears, Unit XYZ to headquarters. Go ahead, XYZ. We've had a mechanical breakdown. Quiet. Headquarters communications suspicious says, what's the nature of the breakdown, XYZ? The cops come back and say, we ran out of gas. So the uniformed cops ran out of gas, and the communications dispatcher has got to come up immediately with another group of officers to handle this. And all the other cars are out of service too. So they reached into what they had available, and they had available up on K Street, staking out business offices for typewriter thieves. They had a sergeant and they had 2 police officers surveilling these commercial offices for typewriter thieves. These were undercover officers with no uniforms. In fact, one of the officers was ridiculously dressed in women's clothing with a ridiculous wig, okay? So, the sergeant and the 2 officers, according to my source, the guy that listened to it, are dispatched from K Street close by to the Watergate to handle a burglary. Baldwin, the FBI agent, apparently did not make them as cops.
He's the lookout. Baldwin is the lookout?
Yeah. Apparently he didn't make them as cops, so he didn't radio across the street to say the cops are here, dump everything, get out. So the cops get into the building, the security guard guides them up to where the problem is, and the undercover cops nab these guys, as Angelo described, as dirty as you can get them, with all the evidence, which gave the FBI clear jurisdiction. There would have not been a Watergate if they had dumped the stuff outside and got away. So this only occurred anecdotally because the cops ran out of gas. Now, throughout this case, there are many instances where these things occurred, and what it points out is any investigation that you do is going to have these kinds of elements. Happenstance, not being able to predict, not being able to compensate for a mistake, an oversight, underreaction, overreaction. The cops ran out of gas. It doesn't get any better. And you can imagine, we're all being paid for this. We're being all paid for this to have this great experience that we're sharing in some form with you tonight. We haven't lost our enthusiasm when we get together and talk. The emotion from this case is never ending. It is lifelong.
Well, let's talk about a very emotional part of the Watergate investigation, and that's the leaks that keep pouring forth from the Bureau. And when you go in that day with Gray, you're put on notice that there are leaks coming out.
Well, you didn't have to be an intellectual giant to figure that out, because a lot of our work product that we did, say, on a Tuesday would appear in the Washington Post on a Wednesday.
Right.
So it was so close together, it had to be coming from the FBI.
Were you frustrated by that?
One of the original aspects of leaking, and this may sound strange, but it actually happened, while the police department and assisted with the FBI agents are searching the 2 rooms, standing at the doorway was a detective, and next to him was a person shorter than me. In some of the books you read, I'm supposed to be 6'2" and whatever. But anyway, there was a little guy standing at the door, and I worked burglary squad with the MPD for several years, and I got to know Art Smith, one of the detectives, real well. So while Art and I are searching the bed, recording different pieces of evidence, I see this little guy standing at the door, and I said, Art, who's the guy with the detective? And he said, oh, that's Al Lewis. He's a criminal reporter for the Washington Post. And I said, well, why is he here? And he said, he comes out on all these big cases with the MPD. Now, it was a Metropolitan Police Department search warrant. They had custody of all the evidence. Those 2 address books that were found on the bed contained a name, George, and a telephone number, and then the other was HHWH with a telephone number. They were given access to it. We didn't have it. We didn't get those telephone books for, I think, 4 days after.
So the press has.
Because the press was reviewing these books. When the first press leak came out saying that Howard Hunt was involved in the Watergate break-in, number one, their first clue was the telephone book. The clue number 2 was somebody at either in Washington Field or headquarters confirmed that Howard Hunt was a suspect in this. So we started dealing with leaks in, within probably 36 hours.
It didn't, how to say it, you asked a question. No, it didn't bother me. Of course, it didn't bother me because, well, you're more sensitive than I am.
None of your documents leak. That's why.
But I mean, it didn't bother me because we were doing what we were supposed to do. And in any event, we were continuing. I resented the fact that some of these newspaper claimed to be their work product, when in fact it was not. I remember reading a couple of paragraphs on the front page of the Washington Post, and they were verbatim from what I had dictated in an interview the day or the 2 days before. And I was upset because they didn't use quotation marks. But no, I wasn't upset. We're going to do what we're going to do anyway.
All right, so let me throw out a name, and then after this, we're going to move to an audience Q&A, so be thinking about the questions that you have before we take our break. Mark Felt, number 2 person at the FBI under Gray. We know now that he was Deep Throat. He was Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's infamous source. Is he a hero? What do you think about him?
Today? He was never a hero.
Right.
Never a hero. Confirming, like I said, I don't know who confirmed that Hunt was involved. Was it somebody in the field office or was it headquarters? I always suspected that it was headquarters because I believed in our guys. When the FBI conducts an investigation, a criminal investigation, you're dealing with 2 agencies or 2 departments, Department of Justice, the prosecutors, and a federal grand jury. And our role is to investigate, present the facts. We don't tell anybody. The sad part about it was leaking the information gave the public insight as to what we were doing. We took a step back and said, it's going to turn people off. And it did.
Right.
There were interviews that we couldn't conduct. People wouldn't come to us. I said before, we were programmed to not conduct interviews in the presence of a lawyer out in the field. Washington Field, you did it in the presence of a lawyer. And those people that we were interviewing, some of them gave us good information, some of them gave us information that was bogus. Right. Wouldn't go anywhere with it.
So, Angelo,
but as to
I just want to say something about Gray when you're done. My problem with Gray after all the stuff has come out is that I feel with him.
Gray or Felt?
Felt.
Okay.
Felt. I felt betrayed. I mean, he was allegedly one of us. And by doing what he did, he wasn't one of us anymore. He was willing to give us up for perhaps being the director of the FBI.
Angela, did
he
you
was
ever
never
meet
one
him?
of us. He was never one of us.
He was never
Nah,
one of you.
I mean, maybe when he came into the FBI as a field agent and did his work as a field investigator, maybe then. But when he started, going up to the top and he being promoted and all the rest, he had become, as a matter of fact, as an inspector, a really bad reputation. As a matter of fact, they called him the White Rat because he had gray hair, and he hurt a lot of people. He was a hatchet man. He hurt a lot of agents, and some of these agents didn't deserve the type of treatment which was meted out to them. like, for example, they were fired, or they were censored, or they were on the bricks, as we say, in other words, suspended for a couple of weeks, and they didn't deserve this. And so he was not very well liked, and especially during that time, from inspector all the way up to where he was at the time of the Watergate, he was never one of us. He was never one of us.
Do you all feel this way? Yeah, Plinick.
I just wanted to add that while I won't throw Felt out completely, I think he had two motives. One, he wanted to be the director really badly. And number two, he was seeing the FBI being prostituted by the White House. They were interfering or trying to interfere with our legitimate, worthwhile investigation. And I'm sure that rubbed him the wrong way.
I don't want to create an argument.
Which
here, but he
motive
said no.
was stronger? I don't know.
Who said no?
I don't know.
I said he could have.
But,
Yeah.
but I believe that you have two things to think about when you judge Felt. Now, with Gray, I think Gray had a good heart. I think he wanted to do good, but he could not resist his training of obeying the commander-in-chief or those representing the commander-in-chief. And that's where he got in hot water.
I don't think there's much heart in the FBI. The FBI ran on fear. Every agent under J. Edgar Hoover, and for years after Hoover's death, was in fear of what could happen if you made what was conceived to be a mistake or, God forbid, embarrassed the Bureau. That said, I want to share with you an anecdote about Mark Felt. Keep in mind, he was a brilliant FBI agent. He was right out of central casting. He was perfect as Hoover's successor in every way. I'm sitting in the Fort Worth resident agency out of Dallas as the brand new agent in 1969. All my peers were senior men who had done accomplished things other places and were finishing out their FBI careers where they wanted to be. We were illegally, according to Bureau rules, secreting ourselves in a locked room in our resident agency with the front door locked for about 15 minutes while we surreptitiously drank coffee. During our time in the FBI, you were forbidden to drink coffee. I think if you were drinking coffee, you were seen to not be working. So we couldn't drink coffee, but we had our hideaways, and ours was in the office. We were there a short period of time when our manager, James Von White, came back and said, "Golly, have you heard what happened in Oklahoma City?" Well, we said, "We hadn't heard, James. What happened in Oklahoma City?" Gee, the SAC went to a law enforcement gathering of FBI National Academy graduates. This institute we run at Quantico for chiefs of police and high-ranking individuals as a training mechanism. He went to a get-together of these graduates in Durant, Oklahoma. He got drunk. He got in an argument with the chief of police's wife, and he poured a drink down the front of her dress between her breasts. Collectively, there was a groan. Oh, no. What happened after that, James? Well, unbeknownst to anybody in Oklahoma City, Mark Felt and 3 inspectors' aides flew out, secretly rented cars, and began taking affidavits from the police chiefs and high-ranking officers who witnessed this event. After they completed that investigation, Mark Felt, unannounced, walked into the Oklahoma City office, asked to see the SAC, was escorted into his office, served the SAC with a termination order, fired the SAC, gave him a check with his full pension contributions with interest, and escorted him out the front door. He was finished with no retirement, no bennies, and no future at age 47. All 11 agents who were asked for statements because they were at the affair allegedly were in the men's room and witnessed nothing. It was a small men's room. There were only 2 urinals, I was told. So this must have been quite a scene for 11 agents in that restroom. This gives you an idea of who Mark Felt really was and how the Bureau ran with respect to internal discipline. And I suggest to you cadets sitting out there that there's a certain degree of fear that drives your behavior and your conduct at the Citadel. So fear is not necessarily a bad thing. Fear can be a very, very good oversight.
So I want to get to the Q&A, but I also want to whet your appetites for after that, because you bring up Felt as sort of the henchman, and Lano at some point, Mr. Lano at some point in the investigation, Felt makes a suggestion that you should be fired for one of the interviews that you do, the one with Martha Mitchell. So I'm hoping that we can hear that story when we get back from the Q&A. But at this point in time, I'd like to turn over the panel to the audience. What questions do you have for our panelists here today?
How about right here? You got, lady, you got a question here?
He's going back there.
Oh, they're back there.
Oh, I thought you were someone here.
Hi. Hi, thank you. Earlier you said that had Hoover survived, this wouldn't have happened. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that. That went by a little fast for me, and it sounds very interesting.
All right, so our questioner is asking, earlier you said that if Hoover were alive, Watergate would never have taken place. Why, what made you say that?
Well,
you go next.
Why wouldn't it, how to say that? John Dean didn't say no. I mean, to Gray and Felt. They were willing accomplices of providing the White House with information I don't think they should have. That never would have happened. John Dean or anybody else would never have called over to FBI headquarters and asked to speak to Hoover and say, please, I want the stuff from your agent's investigation. It just would not have happened.
Ehrlichman tried and got thrown out.
Yeah, it just would not have happened.
And I mean, was there a sense, at least in the Bureau, I know the historical record reflects that, at least for a while, the public believed that presidents feared Hoover.
Right, they all thought they had a dossier. The FBI had a dossier on everybody. As a matter of fact, I remember there was a time when if you didn't have an FBI dossier, you were a nobody. Our records at the time were just not kept that way. We didn't have a file on you, sir. We might have a file on everybody else in this room, and your name might appear in that file, and we could gather all that information together. But to have an individual file just did not exist.
It wasn't Watergate. Maybe it would not have happened, but it did happen. In 1971, it happened. J. Edgar Hoover was still there. That's right. It was the break-in of the psychiatrist office of Daniel Ellsberg in California.
And that was carried out by the plumbers.
That was carried out by the plumbers.
But no one asked the FBI for the information.
Correct. Well, what happened was the plumbers were formed because the FBI was investigating Daniel Ellsberg for the leak of the Pentagon Papers. Numerous offices around the country were involved at the time. The results of that investigation, unusual to the Watergate, was that the information being gathered by the FBI was being passed back to the White House. Two people who had access to that information was Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy. They were not satisfied. They went to their superiors saying, the FBI is really not doing a good investigation here. Daniel Ellsberg, give us a break, let's do something. Enter John Ehrlichman, gives the approval with David Young and Egil Crow.
So let me make sure that I understand what you're saying. Nixon is asking the FBI for information. The FBI is not doing a good job providing it.
The Ellsberg investigation results, investigative results, were being turned over to the White House because the investigation did not involve anyone in the White House. It was someone who perpetrated the leak. So we could the FBI headquarters could disseminate that information. But these people in the plumbers unit were not satisfied with our results. Consequently, they went out and did their own thing. So it may not have happened, but it did happen.
Right. Yeah.
May I very quickly, on a timeline, what Angelo was just talking about, the FBI did not satisfy the expectations of some of the higher-ups in the White House, which led, in fact, to the formation of the plumbers to do what Hoover would not do, conduct spying, surveillances and stuff like that. So the plumbers were formed and funded by the immense amount of good work that Maurice Stans did as the fundraiser for the Republican Party. So they had oodles of extra money we don't know what to do with. They fund the plumbers. You have carte blanche to do whatever you want, and you go do all this intel collection, which led, in fact, to the Watergate burglary and the wiretap. So there's a timeline which really it says, Hoover says no, and say, well, we'll do it anyway ourselves.
Right. I think we had another question over here. Do we have another question? All right, we have time for maybe one more question before we take a break. Do we have any other questions?
Let me say one quick thing. There's
a question.
Oh, there is a question. Where?
There's one right there.
Raise your hand high if you have a question. All right, we don't. What was
Okay.
the comment?
We were not, there's the question. We were not gray at the time of the Watergate. We were in our 30s. We were new guys. I had 7 years in the FBI. The rest of us were all in our 30s also. We were youngsters, and we weren't chosen. Did you already say that? We weren't chosen. We just happened to be in the right or wrong place at the right or wrong time, and we got kind of stuck with it, which we absolutely love, because what is better for an investigator to do but try and solve a big problem? And that's what we did. Thank you.
And Bob Kunkel dispatched me that morning in my discussion with him that I'm going to baseball practice, and he said, no, you're going to do this, and you'll be back in 2 hours. I think my wife will testify that it was midnight when I got home.
It wasn't 2 hours later? You didn't solve the Watergate burglary in 2 hours?
2 hours is supposed to be.
She's still complaining about the rain baseball practice.
Oh.
You talk about fear in the department. Did any of you worry about retribution from the department, the government, anybody? And did any of you experience any retribution as a result of what you did on the Watergate investigation?
John Kleinig and I were just briefly discussing that this morning, and we said that it's about retribution.
Oh,
none of us.
Oh,
I just found out today, or last night, that Gene had my income taxes audited. Because I was such a wonderful person.
But within the bureau, though,
no,
I don't know of anybody. Nobody was censored.
Excuse me. In the FBI, when you got in trouble, you got the least thing that could happen to you is you get a little letter of censure, slap on the hand. Probably the worst thing, you could be fired. And then there's all in between. You could get transferred, put on the bricks without salary for 30 days, stuff like that. Nothing like that happened to any agent for the entire investigation, 2.5 years. However, we lost an acting director who was later indicted, and we lost a president. But no agent was censured. Pretty interesting.
All right, well, thank you. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll reconvene. So we'll see you in 10 minutes. right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and reconvene in a minute. So if you'll go ahead and take your seats, we'll get this thing going in just a minute. Thank you. Can we try it again? All right, we're going to reconvene in 1 minute. So go ahead and find your seats and we'll reconvene in 1 minute.
Sorry.
Yeah?
He's a doctor. He head of some division. He worked with my daughter for years.
Oh, you have name tags now. All right, so we'll go ahead and start things off where we left it. And Mr. Lano, I have to ask you to tell us a story that you have about Mark Felt. And I think this is a good way to kick things off because you did an interview of a woman named Martha Mitchell, and Mark Felt was not very happy with you for that interview. Can you explain what happened?
One of the other rules in the FBI is you do not record or have someone record your interview. So I was going down to the prosecutor's office one day, and I stopped to get a cup of coffee. I didn't tell John I was doing it though. But anyway, and there was Martha Mitchell giving a recitation to one of the TV outlets and saying that her husband was not involved, that the Watergate affair was, excuse me, was cause of the president, and she just went on and on and on. So when I got to the prosecutor's office, I said, I think we really ought to get her on record, and they agreed. So they suggested that I call.
Can I cut you off? Because I think a lot of people in the audience don't know who Martha Mitchell was, but she was quite a big personality back then, right? Kind of a celebrity.
Martha Mitchell was the wife of John Mitchell, the Attorney General of the United States under Richard Nixon. And when John Mitchell left the Attorney General spot, he moved over to become the campaign chairman or the chairman of the committee to re-elect the president. His wife was Martha. They lived in the Watergate complex. On your paper there, they lived in the round section. Bob Dole, senator, lived over on the left side. Anyway, so she was making these statements on TV, and it was agreed that she should be interviewed. So the question was who was going to do it, and I said, well, I'll do it. So I reached out to John Mitchell, the Attorney General, and I said, it's important that I get a hold of your wife and conduct this interview. And he says, okay, I'll get back to you on it. Now, I didn't remember at that time, but she had moved to, they had moved to New York. So I got back to the office that night about 6 o'clock, and there was a note on my desk saying, 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, pick us up, we have firearms practice. totally forgetting about Martha. So the next morning I pick up the guys, we go to Quantico for our firearms training, and it's about 10 o'clock. We're on the firing line, and then the whistle blows. The general instructor, George Zeiss, says, "Lano, you have an urgent telephone call from the Bureau." So I go up to his office and I said, you know, "Which phone?" He says, "This one." He says, "It's headquarters calling, and somebody about Martha Mitchell." I said, "Martha Mitchell, okay." So I pick up the phone, and the Bureau operator connected me with Martha, and she said, "You're Agent Lano?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she says, "You know, I'm free, white, and over 21, and you don't have to call my husband to do an interview." She said, now remember, she's in New York. I'm in Quantico, so I know we're 4 hours away. She says, "I want you in my apartment by 11 o'clock this morning." And I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, I beg your pardon." I said, "But I'm quite distance away from New York. It's going to take me a while. Can we do this tomorrow at 11? And she says, "Yes, be here promptly at 11. I said, "Fine." And before she hung up, she said, "I'm going to tape record the interview." And I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, you can do whatever you want." So I called my buddy up in New York, Vinny Alvino, and I told Vinny to pick me up at the train station 10:30. I'll catch an early metro liner up to New York. So on the way up to New York the next morning, I'm handwriting these questions I wanted to ask her. And there were 7 or 8 questions I wanted to line up. Prepared those, got off the train. Vinny picked me up. We drove over to the apartment. They're up on the 5th floor. I didn't tell Vinny, I didn't tell anyone about her going to record this interview. That is a no-no. The manual tells you it's a no-no. So we're going up on the elevator, and I said, "Vinny, Martha's going to record the interview." Vinny couldn't find a way out. The elevator's going up. He's running around the elevator. He wants out. He wants nothing to do with it. I said, "Vinny, I'll take the bullet for it. Don't worry about it. It's all on me. Just do our thing." No, you can't do it. I said, "I'm going to do it." So we went in. There were 3 women in the apartment. 2 were Martha's aides, and 1 was the secretary for John Mitchell. She came out. She hugged me and shook Vinny's hand. She sat down, and we began the interview. We talked about the apartment, the complex, and I began asking her the 7 questions. And she leaned over to Sandy Hobbs and said, "Turn on the recorder." So Sandy flicks the button on the machine. I proceed to ask her the 7 questions. And at the very end, I said, "Mrs. Mitchell, are you willing to appear before a federal grand jury and repeat the questions answer the questions I asked you?" And she said, "Definitely, I will be there. Just call me and tell me when." I said, "Fine." We got back on the elevator, shook hands, got back on the elevator, got back on the train, went to the prosecutor's office, Earl Silbert, the prosecutors in the original case. I told him what had happened, did the interview. She's willing to go before the grand jury. And I said, "Oh, she tape recorded the interview." And they said, "Well, if it doesn't deviate from what you ask her, you don't have a problem." Got back to the office. Jack McDermott was now the special agent in charge. And I proceeded to inform him as to what happened with the Martha Mitchell interview. And he was quite pleased with it. The only thing I didn't say was I taped it, or she taped it. So he turns around in his desk, and in the desk behind his desk is a drawer, and inside was a red phone. And I knew what that red phone was. It was to Mark Felt's office. So he picked it up, dialed the 1, and he begins relaying to Mark Felt the results of my interview. So 3/4 of the way through, I'm figuring, I got to let the cat out of the bag here, so I signaled timeout. He put Mark on hold, and I told him, I said, "Boss, she tape recorded the interview." Well, him being the great Irishman that he was, if he thought Gray turned red, McDermott turned red. He didn't know what to do with me. So he turned around to the phone, and he announces to Mark Felt that Martha Mitchell tape recorded the interview. And then the next thing I know, McDermott's holding the phone out here. Felt is screaming through the phone. I'm sent to my office, start preparing an affidavit, and get back to me in the morning. I don't hear anything, but I know that Felt's coming after me for something. It's about time. It's 2 or 3 years later. I'm down there on headquarters on a special project when John Kleinig comes to me and he says, "Hey, did you see this?" And buried in the FBI file on Watergate is a memorandum written by Mark Felt to Pat Gray, and basically he wants to tear McDermott and I apart. They prepared a memorandum. They sent it to the Attorney General of the United States for prosecution, possible. Thank God it was rejected. On the bottom of the memorandum, Gray wrote, "These men have been through enough. Remind them of what the rules and regulations are." And then on the back of it was this Felt, whenever Felt initialed something, was just an F, a flowery F. This one was like a F, like halfway across the page. I know he was ticked off at us.
What I think is amazing about that story is, you know, when we think of Mark Felt, there are sort of two camps of how people come down on Mark Felt. You have people that think he was a hero, and then you have people that think he greatly betrayed the Bureau. And this story, I think, is really interesting because you're the chief investigator of the Watergate investigation, and we see in the archives that he is offering to Gray to fire you and McDermott at this really crucial moment over this really technical violation that you made. I just, that kind of blows my mind a little bit about Mark Felt.
Yeah, it blew my mind when John showed me the memo that he had written. And shortly after that, I was sent over to headquarters. There was some information developed by the Watergate Special Prosecutor's Office that Felt was involved in some irregularity with a guy named Donald Segretti. And the allegation was that certain information developed in the Segretti case was leaked to the press. The last person to have that information was none other than Mark Felt. So I was designated to set up an interview with him. I conducted that interview, never asked him anything about being a leaker, and at the close of that interview, as I was walking away, he said, "I'm not Deep Throat, I never leaked anything." Not asked, that was just him issuing a statement. A couple of months later, a second request came in to interview him about some missing documents from headquarters file. Again, the interview was conducted off premises this time. And again, at the conclusion of the interview, not being asked, he said, "I'm not Watergate leaker, I'm not Deep Throat, I never did that." Fine. The third interview came up when there was a 3/4 of a file showed up at a potential defendant's home, brought to him by a reporter from a national newspaper. And in the conversation between the potential defendant and the reporter let slip that it's an authentic FBI file. Last in the possession of Mark Felt. So we took him to another agent, McGahee. What's his first name?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, Dan McGahee. And I made arrangements to interview Felt at a motel. Felt came out of his house and came over to the car, and he takes one look and sees me there, and he says, "I'm not getting in a car with him." And I said, "Well, you either get in a car with me, or I just tell the director and Mr. Jaworski that you refuse to cooperate." Well, he did get in the car. So we went to the motel. We spent about 4 hours doing the interview. Again, at the end of the interview, he comes with this, "I'm not the leaker, I'm not Deep Throat, I never leaked anything." So, all his cases were presented to the Special Prosecutor's Office. There was never any prosecution. Later on in life, we learned that, you know, he was in fact one of the main leakers.
Right. That's incredible. All right, so I want to shift gears for a second, and I want to talk about a really important aspect of the Watergate investigation, and that was that you were following the money. And Paul and John, you have a great story that starts with you, Paul. You find somebody from the committee to re-elect the president, whose name is Penny Gleason, and you interview her, and this becomes a key interview of the Watergate investigation. What happened with Penny Gleason. What did she tell you?
Well, Penny Gleason was a very courageous young woman, and we interviewed her on a Friday, and of course you had to have the White House lawyer there, and she was intimidated and said nothing. Said that she didn't know anything, and she was working for the court. She was a insecurity department of the CREEP, or the Committee to Re-elect the President. And so we left and left it at that. Later that night, she called through the office. They patched me through, and she said, listen, I couldn't talk because of the White House lawyer, but I have lots of information to give you. She said that, but I have some conditions before I talk. And I said, fine, what are they? And she said, well, I want you to bring another agent. For some reason, she didn't care for the agent that was with me the first time. And I said, that's not a problem. And she says, I don't want to be seen in an FBI car. So will you bring your personally owned vehicle? I said, no problem, done. And she said, well, then can you meet me downtown Washington? I want to be away from the FBI office, and I want to be away from the White House. Done. So we met her at the prescribed hour, and if anybody knows about Washington in the summer, it's very, very warm and humid. So we began interviewing her in my car with the air conditioning on full blast, and within about 45 minutes or less, the car starts overheating, and I said, this is ridiculous. We can't go on like this. And she's got all this information she's given us, and so I said, well, let me take a break here. I got to call the office. And I called the boss, and I said, hey, look, she's given us all this information, but my car's overheating, and we just can't go on like this. He said, oh, rent a hotel. Okay. So we rented a hotel room, and we interviewed her for about 6-7 hours. And this is the first time that we got an inkling that what was happening in terms of the actual Watergate break-in, because she started telling us about Gordon Liddy, and McCord coming back to the office after they were arrested and shredding files and going through all the filing cabinets and taking some of the material from the filing cabinets with them to another location. And she gave us multiple leads, and she said, if you think I know something, she said, you've got to talk to my friend. My friend is the accountant for CREEP, and I would love to talk with her. And she said, well, let me ask her, and I'll call you back on Wednesday. And this, like I said, was Saturday. And we left it at that. And I waited Monday, nothing. Tuesday, no call. Wednesday, no call at noon. And I thought, well, she's not going to call. Her friend's not going to agree to interview. And that's it. Well, finally, 4 o'clock, she calls, and she said, my friend will talk with you under certain conditions, with all these conditions, right? And she said, she wants to meet you and have dinner with you at the Marriott across the bridge, across into Virginia. And she wants to talk with you and feel you out to see if she can trust you. And so it was John and I went down there, and it was a typical kind of a quote-unquote business type dinner, because there were all businessmen in there. And she finally says, after dinner and after some cocktails, she said, okay, I trust you. she said, let's go to my house. She lived in Bethesda, Maryland, and I'll tell you anything you want to know. So the four of us went back to her house, and she was a single mother with a 2-year-old child, and that was the breaking point in my opinion, because she told us about the cash, so much cash, that the creep had in their possession in the vaults. And she told us that Hugh Sloan was her immediate supervisor. Hugh Sloan was another person that we wanted to interview, but every time I talked with him, he put me off. He's a very, very nice man, very nice man. And he was truly scared about what was going on. And his wife was pregnant and didn't want to upset her and all that. I came about this close to having him talk to me, and but at the end he didn't. He said, he told Judy Hoback, the accountant, that he would have talked to me, or he would talk to me if he didn't get a lawyer. The next day he got a lawyer and didn't talk to me. But Judy kept ledgers, and she gave us information as to where the money was going in terms of Liddy and McCord. Actually, that money was going to them from Stans, Maurice Stans, and she herself didn't have anything to do with doling out the money, but she knew that Maurice Stans' office did that. She did not implicate her boss, who was, again, Hugh Sloan, and from there it just snowballed, because she gave us all kinds of leads which were covered by not only us but also the other field offices. And then she became a good witness, and we, until the time that our FD 302, our report of the interview, became public in the Washington Post by Woodworth and Bernstein, and it was almost word for word. And when I saw that in the Post that Sunday morning, I was astounded. I just couldn't believe it. It was incredulous. Obviously, she called right away, and she was livid. She said, you know, I thought that this was going to be confidential, and it wasn't. It's all over the press, and how do you explain yourself? I said, Judy, I can't. I mean, everything we do is confidential. I don't know what happened here. It was a leak, but I don't know how it happened. And she was scared. And she was scared because she had this 2-year-old child, and she was scared for her and for her own personal safety. And of course, she was dealing with, you know, the President of the United States and down. So that's why she was scared. At one point, she asked us for protection, and we, of course, couldn't protect her, and put a word into the Metropolitan Police Department to, not the Metropolitan, the Bethesda Police, to, you know, patrol the house every once in a while. But she was, in terms of the case, one of the key witnesses, one of the key people who opened the case for us in terms of what had happened. Before, we always thought it was the CIA, because everything was coming up CIA. E. Howard Hunt was CIA, the burglars were CIA, everything was coming up CIA. And somewhere in there, very close to the date that we interviewed her, the money laundering part came up, and we discovered that aspect. Angelo, you could talk more about that than I can. But from then on, we started rolling, as it will. And once we started rolling, we started to get the pieces together to solve the case.
So I want to shift and start kind of thinking broadly about Watergate because we don't have that much time left. And I want to ask, what is the legacy of Watergate for both you personally, but also for the Bureau? Why is this case important? Why are we still talking about it today? Do you think about it from time to time?
Are you talking to me or everybody?
Everyone, yeah.
Let me speak to that for just a second. The unit I was in had the responsibility of antitrust investigations, Bankruptcy Act investigations, interception of communications. Interception of communications is why it ended up in that unit. That unit later became the Watergate unit, and after that became the white collar crime unit, which later became the white collar crime section, and for that matter may be a whole division in the FBI today. That's the legacy of the FBI. Public accountability received, a spotlight was shown on an area of criminality that hitherto did not get a whole lot of attention. Very often in bank embezzlements, the teller gets caught, gets sent to jail. But the guys in the back in the big desks, they got away with murder. Same thing in corporations, the same thing in government. Public accountability changed completely after Watergate. It just, and also, and I don't want to belabor this, but we used to have a organized crime investigations, and then white collar crime investigations, and public corruption investigations, and when you put them all together at the circle, it was all the same. It was absolutely all the same with different names, and it had to do with influence, money, criminality, and power, and they were all the same no matter what terms you laid on them. It was all the very same game. For myself, and probably for the rest of us, we all went on to other things and just moved on, and we're very proud of what we did. We could have, as Angelo said earlier, we could have gotten maybe the short end of the stick, because you have your director go down the tubes, and you say, oh boy, here it comes down. It's going to trickle down into all the way down to me at my low level, but it didn't. It didn't. And so I Professor Graves and you all, the dean, you make me feel more important than what I am, and I thank you for that. I think anybody else, any other agent in my place would have done the exact same thing. Thank you.
I just made a comment. We haven't talked about this, but I was in an office one evening with Angelo and the three prosecutors and Earl Silvert's secretary. And John Dean and his lawyer came in, and he offered a proffer of if my client can say A, B, C, and D, what will you do for him? But if you sat there and listened to him, and he just spoke and went on about his role in the cover-up, you knew, I was a young man, Angie was old then, but I was a very young man of 29, and I'm listening to this man talk about crimes that the President of the United States had committed. And it was, that was a big personal impact on me of listening to this. I can't tell you the outcome of that. We went through it. You had choices to make. We did what we had to do. I'm proud of that. I'm convinced that there are many other agents that would have done the same thing that I did. I had a very prominent newspaper person tell me one time he had divided men into three categories: men that chased women, men that chased money, and men that chased power. He was convinced The best man was the guy that chased women. because the men that chase power and money really hurt lots of people. One other thing that I should note for all the media people, and I should have said this before, for my knowledge, there's only one newspaper outlet that praised the FBI for their investigation, and that was Jack Anderson's column. That was the only one column, and Jack Anderson, believe me, from what I recall, was not a friend of the FBI. But he brought a very nice column what the FBI did in this particular case after it was all over. I appreciate being here. I have never done this before. I've thought about the case many times. What if? But it turned out. Life goes on. It turned out okay. Things fell where they were supposed to, and it all worked out. And again, I thank you for being here.
I think the one thing that stood out in my mind, Leon Jaworski was the Watergate special prosecutor at the time. This is after Archibald Cox was fired. And it was spring of '74. He writes a letter to Clarence Kelly, the now director of the FBI, and he says, I will pay the FBI whatever expenses are incurred if you provide me with personnel to transcribe the White House tapes. I'm sorry, it still runs a chill through me. I know where I am. I know I'm in South Carolina. I know this is, Republican territory. I'm not going either way here. But I served under numerous presidents. I idolized all of them at a time. And I think back to, what did we call it? Kennedy and his wife. Pardon? Camelot. I think back to that. And I envision him, I envision Eisenhower, Truman, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, all of them sitting in that chair in the Oval Office. And I apologize, I had the picture with me and I forgot to bring it tonight. But in any event, Jaworski asked the FBI if they would transcribe the White House tapes. So we reach out to 9 women come in from the Midwest, 2 from Baltimore, and I'm designated to find a place to house these women. I put them in the Howard Johnson's motel on the 7th floor, overlooking the Democratic National Committee headquarters.
Same
their
place
assignment,
Alfred Baldwin was doing his lookout.
Day 1, their assignment, transcribe the tapes. Myself, 2 other agents, Denny Hoffman and Chuck Harvey, were to review what they transcribed. I think they had 3 days of practice listening to the voices, and then they got into the meat of the tapes. And I think it was on the third or fourth day, I noticed that a few of the women were crying. And I listened to the tapes and I said, oh my God, who could envision what was coming out of the mouths of the person sitting behind the Oval Desk and the other people that were in a room with him, Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Dean. It was astounding. If you have an opportunity to go to the National Archives, or if there's a way to do it on a computer, you really ought to listen. You just can't believe what was going on. That was one thing that stood with me and stayed with me for years. I think about it a lot, especially those women, what they went through. They were working 8 to 5, and then they came to me one day, and after being there for about 2 weeks, they said, can we work 3 to 11 because we want to tour Washington and we want to tour the White House. So they made all the arrangements themselves. They did everything. They overlooked the Democratic National Committee headquarters. They saw the observation post. They listened to the tapes. They were as astounded as anyone else. That sticks with me, and it'll probably stay with me forever. But again, I would like to thank the audience for their attention and questions you ask and our participation in what you ask us to do.
The question was asked earlier about what was C2, our squad, what was it like in 1972? And during the Watergate investigation, when we, got fully into it was very hectic. And as I recall, during those times, at that place, in that squad room, we had Angelo here as a maestro, and we were his instruments. And along with the other agents and the other field officers, he directed us. And we together performed a beautiful symphony. We solved the case, unlike what you people who weren't even born yet know about Watergate. You know mainly from the press, from the media. And the media made Felt a hero. And they said that, if it wasn't for Felt, that, the whole republic would crumble. He saved the republic. Well, he didn't save the republic. It was the work of hard-working, family-loving agents on the ground who did all of the work. They took the credit. Felt was just an instrument to Woodward and Bernstein, if you will, and maybe to others. People say that he was also a leaker to other media. And, Felt was an outlaw, if you will, because he breached his oath by leaking this information. In my mind, Felt was not a hero. He was a bum. And the lasting lesson that, in my opinion, to be learned from the Watergate is that government can investigate itself, as we did here in Watergate. And despite all of the ugly truths that come out, all of the ugly facts that may come out, we still come to the conclusion that no matter who it is culpable, guilty of whatever it is that happened. In Watergate, the president resigned. The president resigned because of the work of the government, of FBI, prosecutors, and the courts. Not because of Woodward and Bernstein, but they took all of the credit, and they really cheated us from the credit. Here you have, right here in front of you, all of the investigators that did the work, not all of them, because you have to give credit to the ones that aren't here in their roles in the other field offices. And they did a hell of a job. So I want to thank you, Dr. Graves and Dr. Jensen, and to you all for coming and hearing our tales of woe.
I've been listening to these eloquent appraisals by my colleagues here, so I'm obviously very proud to be associated with them. That said, I want everybody here to know that we all feel that there might not have been a Watergate if it wasn't for Angelo Lano. The leadership, courage, initiative, balance, and perspective that he showed was simply amazing. We will never, ever forget that. I would like to share an anecdote with you. It's possibly not legacy, but it's interesting. I've been challenged repeatedly here at the Citadel in a very pleasant way by Dr. Graves about incident that occurred in the Watergate that is undocumented. It simply doesn't exist in the files. However, curiously, there is a memo, very eloquently written, almost like prose or poetry, which is very un-Bureau-like. It's not the stilted reportorial fashion that agents write in. This is beautiful. It's charming. The incident involves an order I was given, as were 8 or 9 of my colleagues, an absolute bizarre part of the case, which for the files does not exist. That in itself is very threatening. On Friday, April 27th, a beautiful, beautiful day in the District of Columbia. The cherry blossoms are out, the weather is perfect, everybody's in a good mood. It's almost 5 o'clock on a Friday, and we're all just ready to leave, as all federal workers are. Get on with the weekend. The supervisor comes in and says, freeze the book. The book was a register we signed in and out of in the morning and on the evening. When they said freeze the book, I could visualize this glacier coming from the top over the part of the register not enabling me to sign out. Everything was frozen. Don't anybody leave. Shortly, once again, I was handpicked. You, and you. Highly impersonal. You're a body, you're there. You. I was one of the yous. Go down to the SAC's office. We proceed 1 floor down to Jack McDermott's office, and he's seated in this large rectangular office behind a very, very impressive desk, looking very much in command, looking very much like he is enjoying the moment, whatever the moment's going to become. So we lined up around the perimeter of his office, facing him, a typical McDermott way of briefing agents. He brought you in, and you shared his phone calls, and you understood then what was going to happen. So we're watching McDermott. He's sitting there, picks up the phone, he says, get me the head of the Secret Service. This is now about 5:10, 5:11 on this Friday, April the 27th. The White House, the Attorney General, everybody's disintegrating over this weekend, and there is resignations the following week. But this is Friday. This is not the following week. So he wants the Secret Service. Phone rings in a minute or so. It's the Secret Service. Apparently, McDermott picks up the phone and he says, I'm Jack McDermott, the special agent in charge of the Washington Field Office of the FBI. May I speak with the director of the Secret Service? There's a pause. He's not available? Well, may I have the number 2 man? He's not available. Well, is anybody there in charge of the Secret Service? Apparently, they found the acting director at the moment. He probably didn't volunteer. He came on the line. Are you in charge of the Secret Service? I guess he said he was at that moment. McDermott then repeated, I'm Jack McDermott, special agent in charge of the Washington Field Office of the FBI. There will be about a dozen agents walking up Pennsylvania Avenue for the White House. They will enter. They will lock down every business office in the White House, including the president's personal office. They will not allow anybody to enter or leave or take any paper out of any of those offices, including the president. There's a pause. No, The FBI agents will not be surrendering their guns to the Secret Service upon entry to the White House. I'm telling you that FBI agents are always armed. They will be entering, and they will lock down and secure all the offices until further notice. Goodbye. Slammo goes the phone. Oh. And then I won't repeat the word that I said, but it was almost a chorus and a groan. And then McDermott, really enjoying the moment at our expense, of course, does the following. Go on. Any questions? Well, in the FBI, there's never any questions, because the reason they hired you is because you know the answer or you can figure it out. So don't ask a question. Go ahead, take care of it, get up to the White House, lock down the offices. So we leave en masse. Dozen FBI agents in suits like this walking up Pennsylvania Avenue. We went about a block and didn't discuss a plan, didn't say anything. We were in shock. About a block went by, and a voice to my left said, "Hey, men, do you think they'll shoot?" Now, I think the question came to me because I was a defensive tactics firearms instructor, and I was the team leader of Washington's first SWAT team. So as a tactical guy, the question comes to me. And of course, I know about contagious shooting. One gun goes off, they all go off, okay? So we can't have one shot from anywhere. We need confidence. So I said the following. Oh no, I've had a lot of contact with the Secret Service, 2 times. 2 times. They've had a lot of contact with the Secret Service. They're professionals just like us. There's not going to be any shooting. When we get there, West Wing, when we get there and we enter and we approach the entrance with the Secret Service, get those creds out. They're a little smaller than this, okay? But they've got the big blue FBI. I said, wave those FBI creds and get that badge and chant, FBI, FBI. Let them know who we are. So here's the scene, entering the White House, not knowing if there's going to be a shooting, and there's these 12 guys chanting, FBI, FBI. And every one of us is thinking, oh my God, what? You know. But nothing happened. We didn't surrender our weapons. We entered. The Secret Service was very, very accommodating. We locked down and we stayed on post literally for the balance of the weekend with shifts changing. Went all the way through that weekend, okay? Nixon is at Camp David, and he had been going through apparently some gyrations in his mood and had been drinking. He comes back, it was Sunday night, I believe, comes back and he's in a horrible mood and he's been drinking, and he comes in with his entourage, he goes by some of the offices and he stops and he yells, referring to the aides that had these offices apparently, this is terrible. These men are not criminals. You should not be here. This is awful. So he goes into a rage. Agent stays on post, and the entourage leaves. Later, Nixon comes back by himself. The agent on post was not physically imposing. He was rather on the small side and very light. But he was standing rigidly at attention as the president approached. He was in a worse mood. He came up and berated the agent, grabbed the agent by the lapels, lifted him, slammed him repeatedly against the office door, screaming that this shouldn't happen. This was an outrage. They were not criminals. And you can imagine the scene, the agents bouncing off the wall. with the president mugging him. So my line has always been, when I tell a Watergate story to a group, my line has always been, what do you do when you're mugged by the President of the United States? And of course my answer is, not much. Okay. So I wanted to get that out there, but the interesting thing about this is, Dr. Graves and I have been going back and forth, and Dr. Graves, who has done this exhaustive research in the files and discovered so much, cannot find a single memo that commemorates this rather radical action that we took over this weekend. And so I think there's a degree of questioning that remains. Did this really happen? And of course I can attest to all of the details that I've shared with you, and in fact it did happen. But once again, in Watergate, there's this kind of aura of questioning of who wrote what, who left something out. I think that'll always remain to a certain degree, but this conference that we're so privileged to be a part of at this very, very distinguished institution. And believe me, when I came on campus and I've had a chance, I've been here for about 2 or 3 days, actually on campus, and I've had a chance to see the cadets, I've had a chance to interact with the faculty, a couple of whom have had FBI experience, and meet the rest of the faculty. It's just been, for me personally, a very heartening experience in terms of knowing that our country future is in great hands. As far as the legacy of the Watergate is concerned, I think for everybody it's a rather inspirational experience, and what it comes down to me is what's very American for this group in our audience and every American is this: we do the right thing. We do the right thing no matter what the jeopardy, no matter what the cost. We make mistakes, we forge ahead, we regroup, but when it comes down to it, we do the right thing. And we're no different than any other American. We're part of you, the audience, the institution here, what you stand for, and every citizen who's out there in every capacity. So for me, the legacy is quite emotional, quite personal, quite uplifting, quite uplifting. In fact, Paul and I, on the personal nature, kept touch with Judy Hoback, the key witness that we interviewed. And a couple of years ago, we decided to have a reunion. So Paul and I and my wife Carol traveled to Florida, and we spent about 4 or 5 days with Judy and her husband and her family. And we merely talked, and we merely shared our experiences and enjoyed each other's company. So the case lasts, and it lasts, regarding the people who were key, and Judy certainly was one of them. And Judy said something to me that I'll never forget. She said, "John, I'll always regard you and Paul as my guardians." And I get emotional when I think about that, a guardian of a key witness. The other legacy of Watergate, which is very, very interesting to me, the 2 individuals that Paul and I handled, Judy Hoback and Peggy Gleason, both women, they were the ones who came forward. Judy, in a lot of jeopardy, a widow with a young child, and needing that job. So she sacrificed and put herself in jeopardy, as did Peggy Gleason. Last thing I'll leave you with is this: both Peggy and Judy had strong religious backgrounds. One was a Catholic, and I can't remember, a Quaker. Judy was a Quaker, and Peggy came from a very strong Catholic family. So for me, I remembered that commitment to religion, strong fiber, but doing the right thing. So that's my personal legacy, Watergate.
Angela, you had one more comment, and then we're going to open it up for one more question from the audience.
I'll be brief.
Yeah.
What John's talking about, it's not in headquarters file. You'll find it in the Washington field office file.
Okay.
You'll have to do an FOIA on that one. Number two, yes, Judy Hoback did play a very important role. However, Judy Hoback's most important part in the interview that Paul conducted resulted in great cooperation from Hugh Sloan. However, we did attempt to interview Sloan on 4 occasions. And when he appeared before the Senate Watergate Committee during the Nixon, prior to the impeachment, he testified before the Senate that he had never been interviewed by the FBI. The reason he wasn't interviewed, because they took his Fifth Amendment right, and he wanted to have counsel present.
Yeah.
But the information John's talking about, you'll find it in the Washington field office file.
That's a great lead. Thank you. All right, last comment.
Very quickly, we 5 are being drenched with the honor of being here and your presence. But there are others up here that you can't see. And they are the wives that put up with all of this for 2.5 years. And their husbands being late and can't go to baseball practice and can't do this and can't do that, and putting the night calls and everything. I know I worked every Saturday for years, and we loved it, but the burden really was on the wives, and God bless them. That's all.
Great. Well, you have been a patient audience, and we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Jensen to close this out. I believe our panelists will be here afterwards, so if you have a question that you're dying to ask them, you can still ask it. But I appreciate the attention that you've given. I think it's incredible that you were able to share this story. Thank you for allowing the Citadel to be the venue in which we hear this. And just personally, all 5 of you are heroes to me, and this has been a wonderful experience learning your stories, and I hope that you take away from their stories as much as I have. So thank you.
Dan, appreciate it.
Thank you. Let's have a huge round of applause for these folks for doing this. I've got to tell you, keep it up, please. These gentlemen, Dr. Melissa Graves, come on, you all stand up. Fantastic.
Watergate.
So thank you all for coming out tonight. I've got to tell you, I have never been prouder to have been an FBI agent. So thank you all so very much. God bless and safe trip.